there's something terrible about knowing about world music or about different versions of Mozart as it's performed in different places, or being able to discuss the relationship between opera in Argentina and opera in Paris. That's all fine. Right? My point is that forgetting that that is culture, in not recognizing that that is inhabiting a certain kind of culture, is problematic. It's a naive illusion about yourself, but it also tends to make cosmopolitans fail to understand their relationships to the people who are not traveling as much, or who are just sitting in coach. The people who are traveling only to migrate, right, for work, not because they have jobs with multinational corporations. That it tends to introduce a self-understanding that makes the cosmopolitans miss much of what is going on for everyone else. And this extends, I think, into calls for cosmopolitan democracy. Calls for a kind of pure proceduralism in which any sort of intrusion of particular culture or local social solidarity is a problem to be erased. We must escape and leave behind culture and enter into what we might think of as the Habermas space. The Habermas space is a space in which we are committed to communicative action. We are committed to basic moral values. We are committed to public discourse. Right? And we believe we can organize this by the means of abstract rules, proper constitutional patriotism, right? And that this is opposed to other strong cultural forms of identity or establishment of meaning. Now, as you may know, in the last several years, Habermas has begun to deviate from Habermasianism. He has become not an anti-Habermasian, but no longer the most Habermasian in the world. I now think actually Sheila Ben Habib is the most Habermasian. But in any case, right, Habermas started several years ago taking up questions of religion. It produced some shock and horror among the Habermaniacs, and some sense that he was somehow deviating from the position they had worked so hard to learn as they read all of his difficult writings over the last 40 years. But Habermas began to say that renewing our lives together and even renewing left-wing social struggles may depend on semantic contents from somewhere else. That is, religion may offer sources of meaning and forms of solidarity that are actually important. In addition, of course, it's important for people who are not moved by religion to understand religion because it matters a lot in the public sphere. Right? Habermas doesn't necessarily go all the way, certainly doesn't become religious or embrace a particular position, and he still thinks that there are parts of the public sphere that have to be kept protected. For example, he thinks that if anyone in a legislature makes statements justified by religious belief, those should be expunged from the record of the parliamentary debate, because that should be kept perfectly secular. Right? So he still is drawing a line, but he's moved the line much further to recognizing that people enter the public sphere with culture. Charles Taylor, the Canadian political philosopher, would go one step further and say it's not just a matter of religion. All sorts of cultural differences pose similar challenges to mutual understanding, similar difficulties of grasping each other, but also offer opportunities. And in any case, this is simply the way people are. They always come with some culture, some loyalties. Sergio Costa has argued against the popular versions of cosmopolitan democracy, that it essentially recommends taking advantage of the political opportunity of extending the undeniable conquests accomplished by the civil societies of the North over the rest of the world, and any theoretical restrictions seem insignificant compared to a political possibility of such grandeur. In other words, right, he suggests, and he puts it explicitly elsewhere, the underlying ontology of much of the account of cosmopolitan democracy is based on the rich societies of North America and Europe, and the proposal is one of extending this outward. Right? It is not a proposal to invent something new from other locations, because the significance of other locations has been denied. those other locations, those other cultures, including political cultures, including movement cultures, those cultures are said not to be significant because what is significant is a project of formal design, of effectively constitutional patriotism on a global scale, working out the best procedures for relating to each other, not coming together from perspectives in which location and history matters. Or again, right, the American journalist Thomas Friedman writes, the world is flat. You might ask, for whom? Right? It is flat for certain agents of global capital who are able to open call centers in India or Ireland, right? It's not flat for everybody as they move around. But this is what I mean by a class consciousness, by a misunderstanding of the world that is not just an accidental intellectual error, but is reinforced by material conditions of capital and of travel. So cosmopolitanism, right, comes to be seen as a key good in an era of globalization. It's the way to be good. And I want to suggest it is a perfectly good thing. It is good to be cosmopolitan, but it is not equated with the good. It doesn't define the good, right? It overlaps in some ways. Now, by contrast, nationalism is seen as almost always negative and bad. If cosmopolitanism is implicitly a compliment, you're such a cosmopolitan, right? Nationalism is usually, including in academic quarters, an insult, right? There are plenty of bad examples. Nationalism carried out in horrible ways. The images continue to be familiar from nationalist struggles today. But nationalism has had romantic admirers. It's worth thinking back to what has gone on with people who are moved to paint, like Delacroix, who are moved to write national anthems, who are moved by various struggles. And part of what has gone on is that nationalism, right, has often been closely identified with social movements trying to make the state serve the interests of a wider range of its citizens. Revolutionary movements and non-revolutionary movements alike have been organized in national terms because nationalism underwrote the idea that the interests of the working class were as important to the future of the country as the interests of elites, and therefore the working class should have better representation. Or women should have representation because they were part of the nation, or minorities, or so forth and so on. Nationalism is often closely integrated with democratization and with egalitarian movements. Not always, certainly, but sometimes, and this accounts for some of the admirers. Sometimes more ugly, sometimes more benign. Right? Anti-nationalism, moreover, often appears in just as ugly a sort of framing as nationalism's propaganda. This is an American poster about the importance of defeating Germany in World War I. Right? Destroy this mad brute. It is obviously a takeoff on the King Kong movie, right? Where the giant ape carries the woman, right? But here the giant ape is the Kaiser, right? And this is, again, made possible by imagining that we stand in a position of civilization against others who stand in a position of bad culture. Social scientists like to debunk, is what we do in part. We like to puncture myths. We like to correct false understandings. And we spend a certain amount of time correcting nationalist illusions, and many of them deserve debunking. But nationalism has good sides, right? For example, as I've suggested, it is often basic to democratic movements as they've existed in the world. Now, to be clear, it's not going to be basic to global movements in the same way it has been. Right? Nonetheless, right, it is an important thing to think about from the point of view of, say, the World Social Forum and global democratic movements, that democracy inside nation-states may be a crucial precondition of democracy on a global scale, because it may be what limits the opposition of those nation-states to more global movements. In addition, right, we simply have to accept that we can't wish nationalism away. I once wrote an article on nationalism and ethnicity for something called the Annual Review of Sociology in the United States. And the story of this is instructive. that is, I was contacted by the editors, I was younger then, and they said, oh, well, essentially, you're a very promising young scholar. We want to invite you to write an article on one of the key debates. Would you write an article on the relationship between agency and structure? And I wrote back and said, I'm really bored by debates over agency and structure. I can't imagine that we could ever resolve anything very significant in an abstract debate over agency versus structure. But, this is in 1991, I am observing that there is a whole lot in the world that has to do with nationalism, and there's not very much in the pages of our sociology journals about nationalism. I could write an article reviewing the literature on nationalism and what was relevant. They wrote back and said, well, we really do want to include you because you're an up-and-coming younger scholar, but we don't really see the point of this nationalism idea. Please write about agency and structure. I wrote back and said much the same thing about agency and structure. I said, well, really want to write about nationalism. They wrote back and said, well, look, by itself, nationalism is not a big enough phenomenon to be worthy of an entire article in the Annual Review of Sociology. But if you would write about nationalism and ethnicity together, we would let you write that article. Now, I did. But the point is how bizarre these sociologists' view of the world was in 1991, amid the fighting and the breakup of the former Soviet Union, to think nationalism didn't deserve a place. Now, one reason that could happen is a widespread bias in social science to think we should study what we've already been studying and what our advisors and their teachers and the famous theorists studied, not what is actually going on in the world. But another thing is simply that there hasn't been a very strong critical reflection on nationalism since the era of the post-colonial movements, despite things like the genocide in Rwanda, despite the breakup of the former Yugoslavia, which has only lately begun to produce a renewal of work on nationalism, and there's now a lot. Right? But it was so far off the agenda in 1991, partly because it seemed to be vanishing, just like religion. The attitude of social scientists, mainstream elite social scientists, to nationalism and to religion was the same. They were old inheritances that were gradually fading in the face of modernization, vanishing somewhere in the rearview mirror as we drove over the next hill in the future. Well, it wasn't true about nationalism, it's not true about religion, and it's really quite amazing the extent to which social scientists who had thought they had given up the modernization theory nonetheless incorporated the view of the world as progress in which these things would simply fade away. Right? Because you think I'm just kidding about this. This sets up a view of the future as a battleground between progressive cosmopolitans who escape from culture in various ways and backward fundamentalist religious people, nationalists, all those other people attached to the old loyalties. So Anthony Giddens, writing about this, right, says, this is the battleground of the future. Fundamentalism versus cosmopolitanism. Right? And it's going to work on all these levels. I won't read out the whole quote. I'm wearing a coat. Why on earth am I wearing a coat here? Anyway, it's hot. Right? Here is Giddens effectively translated into a British politician's view. Politician with the party that has now become the minority second half of the national governing coalition, the Liberal Democratic Party. Right? That there are two sorts of people in politics: chauvinists, who are reactionary, isolationist, anti-European, anti-immigration, anti-asylum, think one party has all the answers, pro-hanging, anti-abortion, convinced that prison works, little Englanders, centralization, in favor of centralization, and nostalgic for a past world. Right? So all those things are bundled together. But he says there are also cosmopolitans who are outward-looking, international, pro-European, pro-immigration, pro-asylum, pluralist, anti-hanging, pro-choice. They believe in rehabilitation. It goes on, right? Now, there are interesting questions like, why exactly is your policy on whether or not capital punishment should be carried out by hanging related to cosmopolitanism and your view on Europe? They seem to be two separate political questions. But of course, what's being described is an ideological package, And the ideological package is one that fits with a certain kind of style, that cosmopolitan fashion, the things we think are good. The catch here is that this way of framing the debate leaves no place for those people who are looking, say the white English working class, for a place in a national project. No place for their participation in society. It's really great for the people going to ethnic restaurants in London, who are described as the new and modern and good. Nationalism often offers cultures and social connections that can be integrative. Now, here I don't mean nationalism as a right-wing ideology or the excesses of nationalism, blood and soil, but I do mean national discourse, discourse that seeks to integrate and speak to the different regions and religions and cultures and classes of a country, right? To bring them together. And this is vital in the current era. Now, as I've suggested already, right, the tendency to treat nationalism as simply a problem and as destined to fade in the face of progress blinds a lot of social sciences to it, and ethnicity and religion have been marred by similar sorts of views that they may be important to study sometimes, but they aren't part of the future. There is something that is somehow going to fade away. Right? This seems to me deeply wrong. It also seems to me we understand nationalism way too much through examining its excesses. Right, through looking at ethnic cleansing in Serbia or through looking at Nazis, right? And much too little through looking at the positive national programs that have been created and carried out in a variety of settings, and I would add Brazil to those. Right? It amounts also to a form of self-congratulation. Nationalism is backward. We're not nationalist, therefore we are progressive and good. We seldom ask the critical questions that we should about cosmopolitanism. So we ask all sorts of critical questions about nationalism, and economic nationalist and other nationalist arguments tend to be made disproportionately from outside, part of the elite that we're connected to, even if we're dominated within it. But we ought to ask questions about the social foundations of cosmopolitanism. What kinds of class and status distinctions does it depend on? Money, education, access to opportunities to travel, and so forth. We ought to ask questions about how it's complicit with liberal individualism. There was a whole generation of social science criticism of the extreme individualism of much of liberalism, the extent to which it missed the collective dimensions, the social dimensions of social life. And I think this should be on the agenda in new ways for critical analysis. And most of all, right, we need to watch out for dismissing those who are not cosmopolitan as though they are simply backward, not as civilized, not as far along in progress, not as fashionable. Because this creates constituencies for things like very problematic populist movements and others that are movements of people left out often. We need to examine the constitutive role of hierarchy. So cosmopolitanism, I want to suggest, even though it gets approached as openness, and fairness, and inclusion, is also an ideology that structures a kind of exclusion of non-communist, non-elites from the world of cosmopolitanism. I want to wind up with just a couple of remarks. I'm going to sort of slight this. That is, if we're asking about cosmopolis, right, what makes the world whole? How does the polis, the Athenian city-state, get reproduced on the scale of the cosmos? Diogenes of Sinope might not be a perfect master, the cynic who coined the term, who also said we should live completely naturally, and that would be completely globally. We should have sex in public. We should belch without repressing ourselves. He slept in a tub, right? There's a whole package of ideas, right, that are at odds. We need to ask what it is that makes the world whole. What he said was, right, it's all nature. And that's one kind of answer, transformed answer available to thinking about deep ecology or environmental crises. There's another kind of answer that comes in the form of human equivalence, and a third in the form of connections. We'll close with these. how do we belong to the whole? Is it by belonging to a set, a mathematical set of all equivalent humans? Right? Or is it through relationships that are forged? Much cosmopolitan thinking depends on set logic. All humans are equal insofar as they're humans, and they have equivalent rights. This is important for thinking about social justice, but it is misleading because it leaves no place for culture or different forms of social solidarity less than the whole. Right? It's also complicit with property rights. Right? The idea here is that humanity is represented as a structure of perfect equivalence. Right? This tends, as Agamben has noted, though, to get reduced to a logic of bare life, the lowest common denominator of what human beings have in common in a world of camps. An intermediate position is the idea of contact, the cosmopolitanism of cities, which have rich and diverse populations that come into contact with each other. They may not make a new political order, right, but they connect in some fashion. And I want to go further in closing, though, and say we need to build further on the idea of connections. We need to see the world not just as a category of everybody who is human, all of those individuals, because that has a variety of problems. It has the virtues of giving us a vocabulary and a method for assessing justice and equality, but it has the problems of leaving out culture and solidarity, and the problem that it does not give those humans voice. Right? It does not empower them to chart the future. It tends to empower us, the experts, to do analyses of what's best for the humans. We should look for the actually existing cosmopolitan connections, the way in which people are connected to each other, and figure out how to build on that, reform the connections that are problematic, build better connections, but recognize this as a process of historical struggle that cannot ever be complete because human beings are always making and remaking the social institutions in which they live and the kind of connections that exist among cultures. Don't just say, slavery, that was so long ago, it has no relevance. Look at the connections that were forged through the slave trade. Don't just say, oh, we now know that's unjust because of our human rights thinking. Look at the kind of connections that are forged by global capitalism, some of which are very unjust, and ask how they can work. Look at religion as actually a form of connection in the world. Look at the range of diasporas that are actually left out of account in cosmopolitan thinking. The world, then, is knit together out of human relations. It's very incompletely knit together. The goal needs to be to have the human relationships be better as well as to be more knit together. Right? We need at least two ethics. We need the ethic of justice, but we also need an ethic of solidarity, whether constructed in terms of local communities, religions, ethnicities, nations as a whole, or social movements. But it's not the same as an ethic of justice. We need both. Thank you.
Nós estamos concluindo e a ANPOCS agradece a presença de todos e a presença do professor Calhoun, que demonstrou como imaginávamos o brilhantismo e uma forma particularmente provocativa de conversar conosco. Muito obrigada a todos.